I had one of my technicians call and ask for me to order one of these kits today. And this is called a process tube adapter set. You see this kit right here? This kit enables you to take your refrigerant gauges and connect them to the refrigerator without having to add a valve. Can you toss me one of those valves that you've been working on? Thank you. So this is something called a stem valve. The valve has a core inside of it, and we call it a stem valve because it has like a little piece of tubing on the end, like a stem. And like on the compressor here, this is the process stub on the compressor. If we wanted to add refrigerant to the system, we would take one of these valves and we would attach it to the compressor here with a torch. Okay? And that's how we would connect our refrigerant gauges. Let me grab a set of gauges I have here. So, having this valve here on your compressor would give you a place to attach your refrigerant hose so you can, pull a vacuum on it, charge it, what have you. When you're changing a compressor or something, you need to add one of those valves. This is just fine, okay? And I'll demonstrate another time how we're going to add one of these valves. What I wanted to talk about was this process tube adapter kit and how something like this may benefit you while you're working on refrigerators. One of the things that we've been talking about is sealed system problems. I've been doing that as a lecturer in my classes in the online school. One of the problems that you can commonly have with a refrigerant system is something called a restriction. Now, in a refrigerant system, the compressor pumps the freon through this black line here going to the condenser here. This is called the discharge line. And remember, a compressor nothing more than a pump. It's like a water pump. You know how it circulates water throughout the system? It circulates refrigerant around the system. Yes, Rich?
You said it would be you sometimes get a restriction, right?
Yes.
So how would you know if it's a restriction?
And we're going to talk about how to do this and how to check where your restriction is. That's part of the demonstration. So the compressor pumps into the condenser. The condenser goes out this pipe here through a loop around the freezer and comes back through this line right here. And this is where your dryer filter would be to your capillary tube. Now we've already removed it, and there's another video on there that I did when I showed you guys charging, and we tried to attach a valve to the dryer filter here. So we removed this. But let's talk about restrictions. Okay, so you go up to a system, and your low side gauge normally when it's running should read about 0 psi. That is a normal refrigerant pressure when the compressor is running with refrigerant 134A. Okay, but if you had something called a restriction, this gauge will go down below 0 into what we call a vacuum. Between 0 and 30, which is a 30-inch vacuum, that may indicate one of two things. Either there's a restriction in the system, and I'll explain what that is and how to look for it, or you're low on refrigerant. Like maybe it had a leak, maybe the pipe cracked or rusted, or the aluminum sometimes gets pitted and the freon leaks out. Okay? So, first thing you want to do is if you think that the system has a restriction, is you want to have a way to connect your access valve to the system. This is a system that's already charged. Okay? Now I'm not going to show that today, but you would add a little bit of freon and see if the pressures go back to what the normal running pressures would be inside the system. If this side was into a vacuum and not at 0 where it's supposed to be, you add some freon. If it was a leak, it would go back up to 0 like normal, and the refrigerator would start to cool until the refrigerant leaked out again. Almost like when your tire in your car or bicycle gets low, you add a little more air, it's back to normal. You got a nail in your tire, 2 days later, it's low on air. That's what would happen if you had a refrigerant leak. That if it's running, the compressor's running, normally it runs at 0, but if we have a leak, it runs below 0. We add some Freon, like adding air to a tire, we get it back to normal. It might stay there for a little while, depending on how bad it's leaking. It'll probably pull back into a vacuum, almost like that refrigerator, Gerald, that you guys have been working out in the shop there. That you keep adding Freon, and then 2 or 3 days later, we're in a vacuum. Okay? So now, let's just say you in a refrigerator that was in a vacuum, and you added some more Freon. You just add a little bit to see if you can get the pressures to normalize. And it still pulls down into a vacuum. Well, if that happens, most likely you have something called a restriction. And the compressor pumps into the condenser, flows around, and then from here, it goes through this capillary tube up to the evaporator in the freezer, and then back down through this next tube here called the suction line, which is this going back to the compressor. Yes, sir?
Could you say that like simpler? Cause like in like 1, 2, 3, like.
Yes, I can do that. Pause the camera. So here's the basic 4 parts of a system, and then we'll talk about each part a little bit. Is the main part here is the compressor. Okay, this is the pump. All it is, just like a water pump or an air pump, it pumps the refrigerant through the system. It's pulling from one side, pumping it to the other, and it comes right back around. A refrigerant system is nothing more than a circular loop. Just like your heart pumps your blood through your body, and then it comes back to your heart again, and it just continues to do that all the time. That's what this pump does, okay? So this pump pumps into the condenser coil, and I'm not going to talk about vapor pressures and all that, but it pumps into the condenser here, and the condenser releases heat from the refrigerant, and then from the condenser it runs all the way through here, and it goes into something called a dryer filter. The dryer filter, you got one laying on the table there? What happened? Pause it. I will go over some of the parts. Okay, you recording?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. You get that on tape?
Yeah, I did.
It's a good thing I have good editing software. So anyways, the condenser goes to something called a dryer filter. And the filter has an inlet and an outlet. If you notice, the one that's smaller is the one going out. Okay? And it goes from a larger to a smaller tube here. And when it comes out this other side, that tube is called a capillary tube. And if you look how small this tube is. And not only is it small on the outside of it, the tube has a path inside of it. So if it's small on the outside, just imagine how much smaller inside it is. So, yeah, hold it a little bit more straight. Thank you. So the compressor pumps into here from the condenser, and this is supposed to filter the refrigerant. It's called a dryer filter. And a lot of guys spell it dryer like your washer dryer. It's not D-R-Y-E-R, it's D-R-I-E-R. And what it does is it's supposed to trap moisture. Like if you have humidity or something that gets in your system when you're servicing it, this has little tiny balls inside of it, almost like when grandma used to put that bucket inside the basement or the closet where the jackets are to catch moisture and stuff like that, to keep it from getting moldy and mildewy. That's what's inside here to capture moisture. But it does catch a little bit of oil too, because the capillary tube comes out this other side, and if you can see how large this tube is and how small this other side is, that's real small. One drop of water or oil that may get in the system can block the refrigerant from flowing through your capillary tube. And if you have a restriction in the system, your capillary tube is going to be most likely where you're going to have your restriction. Okay? This is going to be 99% of your problems when a refrigerant is going into a vacuum and you're adding Freon, it's not raising the pressures back up. It might be your capillary tube. So one of the things that technicians do is they change these dryer filters. The filter is what's supposed to go before the capillary tube and protect the capillary tube. But sometimes they just get so full they don't do their job, and then it goes out into that capillary tube. Usually your restriction might be the first 2 inches. So you could cut off 2 inches of that capillary tube and get the system back again. So once it goes from the capillary tube, it goes into a tubing called your evaporator. And evaporator is absorbing heat from the refrigerator. A lot of people think that it's cooling the refrigerator, but in refrigeration or air conditioning, we don't say cooling, we say removing heat. There is no such thing as cooling. You might say, oh, it's cold out today. No, there's less heat today than there was yesterday. Okay, everything creates heat. You turn on the TV, it gets warm. Turn on a computer, it gets warm. You use your cell phone too much, what does it do? It gets warm. You drive your car, it gets warm. Any machine you use creates heat. You take your hands and rub it together, does it get cold? No, it gets warm. So everything creates heat. What a refrigerant system does is the refrigerant inside the tube absorbs the heat in the evaporator, which is the freezer, and then it extracts that heat out the condenser. And then it constantly does it again. A lot of people terminate or use the term or the analogy of like a sponge. Take a sponge and you put it in here and it soaks up the water. What do? You squeeze out the water over here and then you reuse the sponge. The refrigerant is constantly absorbing the heat and then releasing it out here. If we don't get the heat out of the refrigerant, it can absorb no more heat. So the refrigerant system is important to have the proper pressures, the proper charges, and everything else. So let's just say we think that our capillary tube is restricted, okay? Well, you can order a new capillary tube and change the evaporator and everything else, but how do you know that that was the problem to begin with? You know, you're just saying, oh, I'm gonna change it, it's a capillary tube. You could be right, but how do you test that? Is there a way to test that? This is what I'm gonna show you today. Pause it. This is coming from the condenser, and this is going into the condenser. So if we thought our condenser was restricted, this one goes in the condenser, this comes out here, but it just goes through a tube in the box. And if you look in that book that I told you about, the refrigeration module, it shows you that tube in the box, and then it comes out this other side. So this is the other side. This is the high pressure side. So if you wanted to check to see if your restriction was in your condenser, these are the tubes we would do. But I'm going to show you the low side and how we check the low side. That is the suction line, which is coming from the evaporator here. And the capillary tube, it's already been cut. We got to be careful. If it gets any shorter, we can't use this refrigerator again. We're going to have to run a new capillary tube. Look how short it is. It's only about 1.5 inches.
Wow.
Okay, now we have another refrigerator just like this where we changed the evaporator and ran a new heat exchanger, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute. And that is the capillary tube and the suction line together. So you can change the evaporator, which is the aluminum tube in the freezer, but the line going to the evaporator and the line coming back from the evaporator is the suction line and the capillary tube. So that is part of the refrigerant system. You can run them up the back of the refrigerator, and we have one in the class where I have you guys work on that. Now, let's just say we think that our capillary tube is restricted. Before I order an evaporator and a capillary tube, how do I know that my capillary tube is my restriction? Well, I want to put pressure and have pressure go through the system and see if it comes out my capillary tube. Because if my capillary tube is blocked, I won't have no pressure coming out, right? So we removed the suction line from the compressor and removed the dryer filter. These two are the low side. But I have no way to connect to put pressure on it. Now I just got cut pipes. So one of the things you could do is you could take a valve like this, take a torch and solder it on the suction line right here. And if you solder it onto here, now I can connect my gauges to it, right? That's a lot of work soldering this valve on there, because when I want to put this back into the system or connect it back, now I have to take a torch and remove it, and then I have to fix it, make sure it's clean, that it's going to fit on the compressor here. So we have this tool here called a process tube adapter. And basically the end of this is a way for you to connect your hose. Look, right here. Now what's neat about the kit is we have these little pieces that go inside, and I'm going to show you how to install it. There is 2 of these. So one you can put on the low side and one you can put on the high side. You can use multiple ones. But let's just go ahead and connect this to the suction line of the unit. Now I'm going to have to get it out of here so we can demonstrate it, so you can see it a little better. I guess we're going to have to fix that later. So this here connects to the end of a clean pipe. So we would slide this over like this and then tighten it up. Okay, we tighten these 2 up. But right now, there's nothing inside. So if I tighten it up, it's just going to fall right off. So that's what these little pieces are for. They go inside here, and when we tighten it up, it squeezes it with this rubber seal in here and allows you to connect it to the pipe. And the reason there's 4 and 4 is 4 goes for one side and the other 4 go to the other side. Each one of them, if you look at the diameter of the hole, are for different size pipes. Yes, sir.
So when you're checking for the restriction and you apply the pressure, if it is, blocked, that's not kind of dangerous, because isn't that pressure gonna have to go somewhere?
Well, yes, and I'll explain that. We're going to connect it, and I have a nitrogen tank here. We're going to actually connect it, and we're going to actually check this for restriction. Yes, sir.
You said to check the line. You gotta
Speak up just a little bit.
You said to check caterpillar tube.
Capillary.
Capillary tube.
Capillary.
Alright. But you said to test it, you gotta remove the suction line from the compressor, and what else?
And the dryer filter. Because the dryer filter here goes like this in the middle, like that.
So you just connect the whole dryer filter.
Now, obviously, before we started this, I had the students remove the refrigerant from the system, remove the pipes, and have everything ready for us, because I wasn't trying to demonstrate how do we take it all apart and how to recover Freon. We already did the class on recovering Freon. I just had them get this all prepared for you. So now we need to find the right size tool that fits over the pipe. This one don't fit. Okay, it's too small. So we have 1/4 inch, 5/16, 3/8, and I don't know what the final diameter is. This one here is too loose. Okay, we want one that fits on the tube pretty good. So this should be the right size right here. Nope. The only one I didn't pick up is this one here. This is 3/8, and it's a little too tight. I can't fit it on there. Why? Because the pipe has been curved. So I'm going to go ahead. Can I have the tubing cutter, please? I'll take the big one there. So obviously we're going to have to fix and repair this low side, but I want to know if this is where my restriction is. This will be done my first time I go out to diagnose the refrigerator. So I'm going to go ahead and just cut this tube to get a clean cut. And this is how I would diagnose if this is a problem. Now, you got to have spare tubing, because once I cut this off, it's not going to connect to the compressor again. So we're going to have to repair this. And that's not going to be my job. That's going to be your job. Okay, so now I've got a straight piece of pipe. I'm going to double check this is my my 3/8. And I go ahead and slide it on there. And if you can see, it fits on there like a ring on a finger. It's not too loose, but it's not too tight. It fits on there. So these are the side I'm going to read. Just got 2 rings with a gasket in the middle. So what we do is we put the back side on, slide them on like that, and then we put the front side on. Now we put this on, we want to push it firmly so that it is far down as it can be. We don't want it like too far up. Now when we tighten these two together, what happens is it squeezes that rubber gasket in the middle and seals that up. So I want to push it down, I'm going to hold them together, and I want to make them somewhat tight because I'm going to put pressure on it. It's not going to blow off. And I'm going to tighten it up pretty tight. So now it's on there. It's not perfectly tight, but if you can see, I try to rotate it, and it springs back, so it's tight. Okay? So now this is connected to the suction line. goes up to the evaporator up top, and the capillary is coming out the other side. So now that I've connected my process tube, I'm going to go ahead and just use my low side hose, the blue one, and connect my hose here, like so. And Javon, you're going to have to like somehow hold it so you can see me connecting to the nitrogen tank and setting that up. Let me just rotate this around because it's a huge tank.
Need some help?
No, thank you though. Okay, first of all, nitrogen. Respect it. This tank, when full, has between 3,000 and 4,000 psi. You know, a tire blows only has 32 psi in a car. That could hurt you pretty bad. This is called a regulator on here, and this controls the pressure from the tank coming out the other side. Do not ever try to use a nitrogen tank without a regulator. If your regulator is damaged, replace it. Your life is at stake if you're not taking care of your tools and your equipment. Now, this here is your adjustment of the pressure coming out of your regulator. We have two gauges on top. The gauge closest to the tank is going to tell me how much freon is it, I'm sorry, nitrogen is inside my tank. The other one is telling me how much pressure is coming out because the regulator is controlling how fast the pressure comes out. Now, because the evaporator inside the refrigerator is made out of aluminum, we can't go over 100 psi. You go much more over 100 psi and you will damage the refrigerator evaporator. You're going to have to replace it. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and open it up for a second. Notice how I backed it off and nothing came out. Put all the paper towels on the floor there. Okay, so if you guys look, can you zoom in on that? That says right now, can anybody tell me what pressure that reads? If you want to come over here and take a look at it.
Just under 2,500.
Yes, sir. Just under 2,500 pounds of pressure. So the tank's been used a little bit, but right now there's 0 psi coming out. So we can adjust this to 100 psi. Sorry. We can adjust it to 100 psi, okay? But we want to go ahead and connect our gauges here. And we're going to use the yellow hose, which is, remember, the yellow hose is always for processing. This goes to our vacuum pump, our recovery machine, our Freon tank when we charge it, goes to our nitrogen tank. Okay? The red and the blue always go to the machine. Okay? So I'm going to connect this gauge. I'm going to go and connect it to my regulator here. And I'm going to adjust it. So if you can see as I'm rotating it, I'm about 100 psi right there. Now it's usually a
That
little.
number is 10, right?
I'm sorry?
That number right there is 10.
It's 100. 100,
It's
200.
Okay.
Okay? It's actually going about 150, which is okay. You say, but wait a minute, you said don't put it over 100. Remember, I can control how much pressure goes into the refrigerator. When I open this, you see how it dropped below that 100? When I opened it real quick, watch, it's going back up. I drop it, so it's not flowing at 100. So I'm gonna go here and I'm gonna watch this gauge go up in pressure. And when it gets to about 100 psi, and if I raise this one just a little bit, that's running at 100. I can open this one up. It shouldn't go more than 100. If I start to see this climb more than 100, I'm going to shut this off. Okay? Now, if you guys listen closely, I'm just going to go ahead and shut it off at 90 per second. If you listen closely,
Yeah, I hear you.
this is coming in. Listen.
You got somebody calling you.
Just decline it. You hear that?
Mm-hmm. I heard it when you first saw it.
Okay, so this is coming out of nitrogen, out of my capillary tube. So my capillary tube is not restricted. But if my capillary tube was the restriction, nothing would come out there.
Oh.
Usually when you have a restriction is not always moisture, it's usually oil. Usually the oil inside the compressor gets pumped around with the refrigerant. Normally a little bit of oil always flows through, but if the compressor runs hot, like the fan here, doesn't cool the condenser or doesn't cool the compressor, and it runs hot, you get more oil than normal. And that's where it restricts. So if there was oil in here, you might see oil come out of my capillary tube.
What happens when the oil gets in there? Does the oil build
It
up
blocks
in
it up.
Okay,
It's like bad cholesterol.
okay, yeah.
You know, it clogs up your arteries and everything else. So right now my pressure dropped back down to 0. So I'm gonna open it back up again. And as long as I don't have oil coming out, because if I got oil coming out, I still might have a problem. And not only do I have to change this in the evaporator, I have to change compressor too. Because if I got too much oil up there, it's because my compressor ran hot. Okay? And that oil going in there is going to contaminate my system, block my system up. So if I had nothing coming out, evaporator, heat exchanger, compressor, and one other thing. What other thing is it?
Evaporator.
Every time you service a compressor, you need what? Or sealed system. Filter dry. Dryer filter. You always replace this whenever you open up a system. Okay, it's just rule of thumb. Okay? Now, if this was not blocked, but I still had a pressure problem, maybe it's in my condenser. Now, it's still connected to the compressor. I would have to disconnect this line and put my process tube adapter here, and it would come out this line here.
If it wasn't blocked.
Yeah. That's how you check it. And having a process tube adapter allows me to connect gauges without having to light a torch and soldering the valve on there, and then later having to take the valve back off with a torch. You know, that's extra work. Yeah, I needed a torch to disconnect that from the compressor, but I didn't solder a valve on there just to check to see if that's where my restriction is. Because I solder a valve on there, and let's just say it's blowing out good like it is now,
Yeah.
maybe my restriction's on the high side, then I have to solder a valve on the high side now. But instead, I just use the process tube adapter, but I change the little piece inside to go to a smaller tube and do the same thing through the high side of the system. Any questions?
Yes. How would you do that in somebody's house?
Well, we have a nitrogen tank that is only about this big, the size of the turbo torch. So my technicians have one, the tank's only about yay big, about 1.5 feet high, and they can do that same pressure. They wouldn't use this giant tank. We have a bigger tank here for the shop because it can be used more often. The smaller tank doesn't hold as much as this tank holds. This is like 3 or 4 of those smaller tanks. So my technicians have that, yes, sir.
So the tube on my right, your left, I mean the gauge on my right, your left,
This,
up top,
okay,
That one-
this one here, or this one?
that one.
Yes.
That one tells me how much nitrogen is in there. The other one tells me how much pressure, how much PSI is coming out.
Correct.
So that one could be, the one on the left that tells you how much pressure is coming out. It could be 1 million PSI as long as you control it with.
The regulator.
Right.
So
Okay,
say-
but I don't want this one to be 1 million, because if I open this gauge up here, if I just crack it, 1 million PSI would blow through so fast, I couldn't control it.
So
It'd
you
be,
still have to monitor this one, because you were
yes,
saying that.
I can raise this up to 200 if I want, watch. But then I watch this one here, and I'm already passing 100, so I can close it here, so it doesn't go past that. Now normally I wouldn't do that. I try to get this around 100, 120. I go a little bit more than 100 because I'm not pressurizing what we call a closed system. It's open on the other end, so it's not holding that pressure and keeping that pressure in. It's letting the pressure off on the back side, which is the capillary tube. Okay? So that's how we would want to check to see if there's a restriction in the line. Now in the classes that I'm doing, I'm talking about different types of sealed system problems, restrictions, undercharges, overcharges, and stuff like that, but I'm going to start teaching this class those of here so I can show the videos to my class out, show them actually what I'm talking about.
So the restrictions on the high side are normally in the cap tube. On the low side.
Well, the cap tube is high side, but it's part of the low side. In other words, I said heat exchanger. The heat exchanger is the suction line which is coming from the evaporator. The capillary tube is going to the evaporator, and the two of them are soldered side by side, and we call it a heat exchanger where it's exchanging heat from one to the other.
So, but I
It
thought
gets changed as one piece. Yes, sir.
the capillary tube don't it separate the low from the high side.
Yes, the capillary tube restricts the high side pressure from going to the low side of the evaporator, correct?
Can you please explain to me what is the different functions of high side and low side? What parts do we have on the high side that we don't have on the low side and so on?
Let's open up the book and then you can look at them, and then if you have a question about each component, I'll be more than happy, because if I go into that, we're talking about a 2-hour lecture.
Okay.
The actual sealed system itself. But I'll show you on your jump drive where it has all those answers and has pictures and stuff. And I'll be more than happy if you read it and you don't understand it, I'll explain to you each component at a time. Yes, sir. I mean, so used to all these guys in the class. Go ahead.
So you got the number one restriction would be in your cap tube. What would the number two restriction be?
Probably the condenser. You'll find more restrictions in the high side for two reasons. One, the cap tube is the smallest diameter tube in the system. Okay? The condenser is the next smallest diameter, as well as it's where the compressor is pumping into. So if it's pumping out oil or other contaminants, it could clog up in the condenser because the fan is cooling the refrigerant down, and if the refrigerant is containing oil in vapor form, okay, then that oil would cool down and coagulate. And I have seen that condenser tubing restrict.
Coagulate, like bubble up?
No, coagulate means like to clump up.
Like
Yeah,
black-
oh yeah.
Like your blood clot or something like that.
Yes,
Not my
yes.
blood. Don't use my blood.
Coagulate would be like adding sugar to something where it makes it all thick and clumpy like. And you remember, when it comes out of the compressor can't pump pure oil like it pumps, like a water pump pumps water. The compressor can't pump refrigerant in liquid form. It can only pump refrigerant in vapor form. If the compressor finds liquid refrigerant inside of it, you can damage the valves and damage the compressor. Now, the oil that flows around with it is because the compressor motor windings get extremely superheated. One, you're low on Freon because the Freon flows around the compressor and cools the compressor down. Two, if you have a partial restriction, most of the refrigerant is trapped on the condenser, can't get to the evaporator because the capillary tube won't let it get to the evaporator. So that means the compressor pulls into a vacuum. It don't have enough refrigerant coming in than it is pumping out. So you have less refrigerant in the compressor, it runs hot. But when the fan runs over the condenser, it cools it down. So the condenser's high pressure vapor coming in and cooling it down turns the vapor back to liquid. Just think of the name evaporator and condenser. When it rains and there's a puddle on the ground, and then the sun comes out, what happens to the puddle? It evaporates. So what is actually happening to that puddle? You said it evaporates, but what is actually happening
It's
with
changing
that?
forms.
The
It's
water
vaporizing.
heating up.
It's vaporizing. It's
Right.
turning from what? Liquid
To gas.
to vapor. So in the evaporator of a refrigerator, it's turning from what? Liquid
to
to
vapor.
vapor. So if an evaporator is evaporating, what is a condenser doing? What does it mean to condense?
Put together.
It's taking the liquid and turning it, no?
It's taking what? The evaporator turned the liquid to a
They're
vapor.
taking the vapor and turning it into a liquid back through the
The
system.
condenser's taking the vapor and turning it back to a liquid.
That's why the heat come from the condenser because it's taking
Condensers under high pressure. What happens when you add heat to water?
Boil.
It boils, and what do you see off the top of the pot?
Vapor.
Steam, vapor.
Yeah.
So the water's leaving the pot. So as you're adding heat to the water, you're turning the water to vapor, and it turns to steam. But if I added something cool above it, that vapor would hit something cool, it would turn to water droplets and come back down.
It will release.
So in a refrigerant system, the refrigerant is just like the water. When we put high pressure liquid refrigerant into the evaporator and we run air over it, remember I said at the very beginning, there's no such thing as cooling, it's heat. So the evaporator's absorbing the heat from the air, and people say, wait a minute, freezer's 0 degrees, what do you mean heat? Heat is not relative as zero considered or based on our body temperatures, because when we say it's cold, because it's colder than our body temperature, and we don't like it being cold. That's what we say cold. But it's just not as hot at 60 degrees as it is at 90 degrees. So you can't base temperature relative to your body temperature. You do that because that's the way you think hot and cold.
Yeah.
You touch water and it's hotter than your body temperature, you say, oh, that's hot. You touch water that has ice on it, you say, oh, it's cold, because it's colder than your body temperature or warmer than your body temperature. 0 degrees still contains heat. 0 does not mean the total absence of heat. It's just less heat than 80 degrees. Okay? 312 degrees is the temperature water boils. All right? 310 degrees, water don't boil.
But you said it boiled at 312.
Yes, but 310 degrees, water don't boil.
What's the difference from them two?
2 degrees. You add 2 more degrees of heat. That is the water's what? What do we call it?
One.
Boiling point. Refrigerants, what makes them all different? 134A, R22, R500, R600A. What makes them all different is they each have their own specific boiling point. The point at which they turn from a liquid to a vapor. If I took 134A, a can right now, turned it upside down and let liquid refrigerant onto the table, it right in front of your eyes is going to disappear. It vaporized. Because the boiling point of 134A is at 0 psi around that point. At the point at which refrigerant turns from a liquid
So vapor.
to a vapor. And you're like, well, how can I see that on a temperature pressure chart? If you look at a temperature pressure chart, you guys have them on your jump drives, by the way, and you look at all the different refrigerants at the top of the chart, okay? And on the side of the chart, you're going to see temperatures. And in the middle of the chart, you're going to see pressures. When you see 134A and you see a temperature and you see 0 psi, what does that mean?
The boiling point.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Because at 0 psi, I can take 134A and pour it onto the table like I pour water, and it'll just sit there. But if I add 1 degree of heat or raise the pressure a little bit, that added heat will cause it to boil. Now, if you look, refrigerant has that 0 psi. Each one is different. Okay? Below the 0 psi, it goes into a vacuum. Like our gauge here. Our gauge has a 0 on it, right? Can you see that on the camera? I'm pointing to it and you don't have it on the camera.
You just started.
The gauge has 0 psi. Anything below 0, it's in a vacuum. Anything above 0, it's in positive pressure. So when our refrigerant pressure goes to 1 psi, the pressure of that refrigerant is greater than the pressure around us. Right now, when a gauge isn't connected, or like this gauge right now, it doesn't have any pressure on it, it says 0, right? Well, we have 0 gauge pressure around us, but we still have pressure around us. It's called atmospheric pressure. The oxygen and the rain and the humidity and everything puts pressure on us. And at sea level, does anybody know what the atmospheric pressure is around us? 14.7 PSIA. Can't talk. Pounds per square inch atmosphere. So at 14.7 atmospheric pressure, our gauge reads 0. It's calibrated to read 0. The gauge pressure reads 0. When we connect this to a pipe and the gauge reads 0, it means the pressure inside this pipe is the same as the pressure outside the pipe. There is no pressure difference. Okay? If I have a positive pressure where the pressure gauge starts going up above 0, okay, then the pressure inside the pipe is greater than the pressure outside the pipe. So if I had a hole in the pipe, would something suck in or blow out?
Blow out.
It'll blow out. So the pressure in here is greater than the pressure out, it'll blow out. Now, when I talk about something that's in a vacuum, if I have a hole in the pipe, will it blow out or suck in? If you think of a vacuum, it sucks in, right? So the pressure inside the pipe, even at 29 inches of a vacuum, almost down here, which is almost at 30 inches of a vacuum, there's still pressure in the pipe. It's just the pressure in the pipe is lower than the pressure outside the pipe. That is the theoretical part, the part that's hard for people to understand of pressures. They say, oh, I'm 10 inches in a vacuum. There's no Freon in there. There's still 10 inches in a vacuum. That is still pressure. It's just lower pressure in here than outside of here. If I'm at a 30-inch vacuum, that's a perfect vacuum. That's outer space. You know, and there's still atmosphere in outer space, but there is no pressure. Our pressure is around the world, around us. So when we talk about boiling points and we talk about temperatures, if the refrigerant pressure is higher than 0, it'll turn from a liquid to a vapor right before your eyes. And 134A at 70 degrees, which is what this room usually is, if you look at the chart, is also 70 psi, gauge pressure. That means the refrigerant has 70 pounds of pressure more than the atmosphere around us. So when I dump that refrigerant out, it's just going to evaporate because the pressure of that refrigerant is so high. When they make refrigerant, they have to use dry ice or some other type of refrigeration system that gets so cold that the refrigerant is maintained as a liquid. And they put it in the tank as a liquid, but they have to manufacture it by putting the chemicals together so it stays stable as a liquid. They can't make it in this room because it's all vapor. They have to make it in a place where it's so cold that all the components that they use to make it, they are in a liquid form. So you look at your drinks, your water bottles, you see the water in the bottle. But if I put that bottle in 312 degree room, it would just evaporate in front of your eyes. That's what we see when we see boiling water. So that's what this gauge is telling me. And you can't get caught up in, oh, it's in a vacuum, there's no Freon in the system. There's no Freon in the system. Maybe very little. Remember, the compressor is pumping it around, so the compressor is showing the vacuum on one side of the gauge because it's pulling from this side, but there's not enough on this side to keep it above 0. In other words, it's pulling faster than the Freon coming in. And it's pumping it to the high side. Normally it runs about 100, 120 psi on the high side. This side could be in a vacuum at 15 inches, but I could still have 50 psi on the high side. I'm low on Freon. I might have a leak and it's low, so that the pressure here is lower and the pressure here is lower. But you have to understand what refrigerant is, and when you service refrigerators, like I told you earlier, it's about the theory before just changing a compressor and using the gauges. I could teach you to use a torch and braze tubing, I could teach you change a compressor, but when you go to a refrigerator that's not working, if you don't have the theory behind it and understand the theory, it's the same thing when you're doing electricity and you don't understand how electricity travels through a wiring diagram. How are you going to troubleshoot a circuit? You have to have the theory or the foundation behind it to help you understand it. Anybody got any other questions about this? Yes, sir.
Did we go, did I miss it? Did we go over what happened if the capillary was blocked?
Well, I said if the capillary was blocked, nothing would come out of the capillary tube here when we do the nitrogen test. But before we did the nitrogen test, we were like, okay, refrigerator's not cooling. The low side is in a vacuum. So we try to add a little bit of refrigerant, seeing if the pressures go to normal.
Right, but, cause I was concerned about possible safety issues, so if it was blocked, if you were like in a real situation and it was blocked, that wouldn't be dangerous for the pressure trying to escape somewhere?
It would try, I mean, technically you should be wearing safety glasses and gloves whenever you work with refrigerant, because when refrigerant evaporates, it's absorbing heat when it's boiling, and you get on your skin, you can get frostbite.
So I was gonna ask, worst case scenario, what could happen as far as safety?
The temperature that it absorbs through heat could cause frostbite, where like it gets so cold that your skin gets freezer burn, and when that happens, the skin dies. It does not grow back. They have to cut that off.
Let's avoid that.
Okay, I understand. I just want you to understand that a lot of people work with 410A on an air conditioner. And I had a former student take my class and get a job with Sears. He went into air conditioning, got a job with Sears. So the technician told him, take the gauges off the unit. An air conditioner. It's refrigerant. Air conditioner, refrigerator, it's all the same thing. Compressor, condenser, evaporator, and air conditioning system is the same thing, just bigger. So he's going to take the hoses off, but it was 410A. 410A refrigerant runs at much higher pressure than 134A or R22. R22 is nothing compared to 410A. So he's taking the hoses off, and when the unit's running, the compressor takes the freon from one side and pumps it to the other side, so the pressure now is like this. When it's off, the system equals out. Okay? So he's taking the hoses off, and as he's taking the hoses off, the high side, even on a refrigerator, you take off the high side, some liquid refrigerant's going to come out, and you can get on your skin. Now, if you do it fast enough, you're okay, but if you take too long, you start getting that frostbite. You'll feel cold. If it's too long, now we damage something, okay? So he was doing that 410A, and I just want to get to understanding. And he was taking the hose off and saw refrigerant coming out the high side, the liquid line, they call it, on the air conditioner. It's the high side. Liquid line, same as capillary tube, where the dryer filter is. So he's taking the hose off, and he saw a lot of refrigerant coming off. So he tried to either put it back on or take it off real fast, but that liquid was coming out. He had frostbite on both hands. He walked around with like bandages around his hand, and you know, like when you burn yourself, you get like a blister. I don't even remember when I burned my hand, I had a little blister on my hand. He had them all on his hand. Luckily, it wasn't so bad that it was permanent, but it was a little scarring. And you could lose sensitivity in your hands depending on how bad it was. He didn't have gloves on. I don't totally blame him because he was a helper, wasn't a full technician yet, and the service technician said, go take the gauges off, and walked away, and he didn't know. He knew how to put gauges on, take gauges off, never really dealt with that 410A, and he got injured because of that. So yes.
I get the frostbite part, the possibility of that, but I think I'm missing something, so I'm gonna simplify it.
Sure.
So if you have a balloon is open on one end, it's closed on the other end. If you apply constant pressure or air into the open end of the balloon, but with nowhere for it to escape, it's gonna burst, right?
Yes.
So would that be a possibility?
Well, when a compressor pumps into the condenser, let's just say the capillary tube was restricted. A majority of the condenser is first made of steel, okay? The compressor can only pump so much refrigerant in till there's no more refrigerant on the other side for it to pump. So even if it's running all day, there's no more refrigerant. The steel condenser is more than strong enough to hold 134A, the amount that's in there, under pressure. This refrigerator, we did the charging of it the other day with the dial charge and the scale, only held, what, 3 or 4 ounces of Freon. You're talking about, 3 or 4 ounces. If you had a measuring cup to hold, 8 ounces or 16 ounces in a cup, whatever, 8 ounces in a cup, 4 ounces is only like this much. It's not a volume so big that the condenser could not store it.
So if it goes unattended, diagnosed or whatnot, could the compressor go out? Because isn't it going to continuously try to pump?
The compressor relies on the refrigerant flow to cool the windings inside of it.
Right, but
So the compressor itself will not blow up, but you could damage the valves in the compressor. You can burn out the electrical windings because now we don't have the refrigerant flow to cool it down. That's most what's going to happen to it. So you could, burning the windings or whatever, and if you have a burnout, that's even worse because burnt refrigerant creates acids and other things when the refrigerant burns and can contaminate the system even more. So that requires to be flushed out. And if you had to flush out a system, the same way we pressure tested for restriction is how you would flush a system out. If you thought a system had too much oil in it or contaminated, and before you put it back together, you wanted to make sure that there wasn't oil in the condenser or something, this is how we would do this. We put a process tube adapter on it, and we want to flush it out with nitrogen to make sure that that stuff gets blown out, and we just put a rag over the other end. Again, it's not going to be like blowing like 1,000 psi. We're only talking about 100 psi, and you saw when it came out of capillary tube, it's not really that great. Now 100 psi in the open air out of a straight tube will be a little bit higher, but it's not enough really to harm you. You wouldn't want to do it without safety glasses because your eyes could probably be hurt from that 100 psi. You don't want to stand right in front of it like this while you're working with it. You know what I mean? You want to be careful, I mean, you can work just like this and do this and this and that and be no problem. Look, I'm at 350 psi right now. So I'm going to back this off some and notice it don't drop down. And you're like, but man, 350, we only said 100. Well, I don't have the gauge open. You can see the gauge is at 0 right now. So I don't have 350 in here because I'll damage the evaporator at 350. So I'm just going to crack the hose. Oh, I'm sorry, the yellow one. That was 350 pounds of pressure, but I only cracked it a little bit. Now, this is nitrogen, not refrigerant. So I'm not getting frostbite from it, but anything that goes from a high pressure to a low pressure creates a low temperature. So you do have to be careful. You should be wearing gloves and safety glasses. But right now, if I close this off, now, what's it, about 100 psi left in there? So I wouldn't want to go real fast, take it off, and have this hose go. I would just do what they call crack it. Just a couple of turns, not enough to take it off, and let that pressure drop. And because nitrogen is not Freon, we're able to let it out into the atmosphere, where Freon, we're supposed to recover that. Okay, and we did that class on how to recover. Remember that blue machine and the tank and everything? So the recovery of it is a different process, which we went over. You can stop the